I don't think it's going to take 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God.
It comes to claims about the supernatural. Not once has anybody demonstrated the truth that there is something supernatural or that it can interact with reality in any way.
Could change just one thing. It would be to dissociate the idea of faith from virtue.
Morality and ethics are the terms we use for how we think about our behavior affecting one another's experience.
So I think one important thing we've got to do is to prize apart religion from morality. It's absolute nonsense to say that you need religion in order to be moral.
Because his worldview does not afford morality. He has to borrow from the Christian worldview in order to argue against it. In fact, he has to sit in God's lap to slap his face.
In my last video, I have demonstrated the impossibility of material scientists to be able to do science within a purely materialistic worldview. It is because the materialistic data is dependent on our own rational capabilities and our own senses. If our rationality and our senses are mistaken, then all the data we gather using these methods are unreliable, thereby nullifying all of empirical science. We have reached the conclusion that our ability to gather data is limited because so many of the values which we derive from reality are either faulty or incomplete. As an example, I mentioned how wool ought to be woven into coats because it is derived from the truth that wool provides warmth. So is the moral value women ought to work the same jobs as men, derived from the truth that a woman's ability is similar to a man's. So essentially, values are the products of truth, which comes from reality. However, human history is riddled by contradictory values which were made across cultures. Many South Africans opted for apartheid until only a few years ago. How many South Africans believed at the time that the apartheid was the true value, while equality between blacks and whites was a false value? Many Soviets believed communism was the right way of government for decades. Many fascists believe in fascism. Many Germans once believed in Hitler, while many North Koreans today believe in their supreme leader, Kim Jong-un. We are not talking about mere differences of opinions, but differences in the perception of the reality of the world. A communist does not see the ideal social structure in the same way a capitalist does. Their values are different because they perceive the truth of reality differently. And so, we seem unable to agree on the values we derive from the exact same reality we are all experiencing together. This conflicting state of values in the human condition has allowed many of the materialists and atheists to assert that there is no such thing as objective morality, which appears to make sense because objective values are universal values. So how can we have them if we cannot agree on what they are? For this reason, the moral anti-realists have come to branch out into three main groups: the moral non-cognitivists, the moral nihilists, and the moral relativists. The non-cognitivists assert that moral values cannot be validated by truth, which means we cannot assert whether a moral value can be determined to be true or false. But when we validate this very assertion that moral values cannot be validated by truth, if it cannot be validated by truth, then this moral value in of itself also cannot be validated, and so it is invalid. Moving on, the second moral anti-realist group is moral nihilism, otherwise known as error theory. Error theory proposes that all moral values are systematically false. So if I say child abuse is bad, the value statement is false. But if I also say child abuse is good, the value statement is also false. All values are necessarily false because they contradict. But again, what about this value statement? All moral values are systematically false. If all moral values are false, then this moral value statement is also a false statement, thereby invalidating error theory from the get-go. So now two positions of moral anti-realism have been debunked with minimal effort. This third moral anti-realist position is the most popular one today, the moral relativism or moral subjectivism. It states that although some moral values are true, they are people dependent, not independent on their own. In a nutshell, the assertion goes that even if some moral values are true, they are relatively true. Again, here we will ask, what about this moral value? That moral values are relative. The relativism of moral values will also apply in this case, thereby making this value a relative one. As a relative value, it means it is no longer objective and so it cannot apply as a general rule. This makes moral relativism a relative value in of itself. This is a problem because a relative value cannot be a truth statement due to the nature of relativism. Every relative value must necessarily have a relative counter value, which in this case is moral values are not relative. Since a relative value will have a counter value, they will both carry equal weight, so they are both nullified. This means that this relative value statement, moral values are relative, is invalidated by its counter value, moral values are not relative. So as you can see, all these positions are self-refuting because by asserting non-objective values, they shoot themselves in the foot because the assertions themselves become non-objective. This means that moral anti-realism is a logically impossible argument, leaving moral realism as the only possible way forward. I have stated in an earlier video, which is linked here, the fact that objective values exist is indicative of the fact that reality itself is objective. This is because values are images of the truth, and truth is the image of reality. However, since humanity struggles to know by itself what that objective morality is, it is because humanity in fact does not know what objective reality is. Had we known what objective reality is, we would have known what objective morality ought to be. So, objective reality is not entirely known to us. There is a part that is hidden from us on cause of our own deficiencies. For thousands of years, we have searched for what is hidden from our sights, but the outcome was never satisfying. This unknowable part of reality has remained constant in its unknowability in spite of all our attempts at discovery, logic, and science. No matter how hard we search, and no matter where we look, the physical world we exist in seems to be always hiding something. And so, the most logical conclusion to this problem is the assertion that reality is divided between the physical and the metaphysical. All the great philosophers since the ancient Greeks have taken jabs at figuring out what the metaphysical part truly is. Plato believed the metaphysical part contained all of reality, while the physical part was a mere shadow of it. Aristotle believed the metaphysical part was immanent with the physical part, and so knowledge of the unknown begins with the known. Those two great schools of thought were later on drastically reinvented in the early modern age into rationalism and empiricism. But regardless of the many schools of thought, which were more often than most in conflict with each other, the problem of the metaphysical realm remained unsolvable. All the philosophers were merely presenting their opinions without proof or corroboration. It is not that Plato and Aristotle were entirely wrong, but they were not entirely right either. We all look at reality with our deficient rationalistic and sensory tools, and we only see parts of it. Other people will see other parts of that same reality because they are looking at it from a different angle. This means that the different worldviews are mere differences of opinion about how we should see reality, and opinions are hardly considered objective values. As different people hold opposite opinions of reality, they will cancel each other out, leaving no room for any value to stand out as objectively valid. The situation was becoming desperate, and a hero was required to rescue the problem of morality from itself. That hero was presumed for a while to be the renowned German philosopher George Hegel. Hegel was an evolutionary idealist. He believed that contradictory values did not necessarily need to cancel out each other, because that's not how the world worked in his view. Hegel believed there is no either-or in nature, but instead there is a constant state of growth whereby people will change from one thing to become another thing. This made the individual to become the focus of reality and not nature. Based on this, opposing constructs like a thesis and an antithesis are in fact conditions of growth within the person himself. Together they would become concrete as they synthesize into a state of becoming for the individual. Ever since Aristotle, the law of non-contradiction applied as the cardinal rule in classical knowledge, whereby A cannot be non-A at the same time and in the same conditions. Hegel, however, did not look at the objects being observed as the true reality. These were to him regarded as mere phenomena. Realism resided within the minds of the beings doing the actual exchange. This is why, for Hegel, logic begins with the identity, the being, where the seemingly contradictory interactions are merely the means by which these beings effect change to become something different. This change in being, or becoming, will allow the individual minds to meander in thought between the thesis and the antithesis to reach meaningful syntheses at the individual level and then at the collective level. All these contradictions in worldviews are no longer seen as conflicts of thought which cancel each other out in meaning. Now they can be seen as positive contributors for the development of beings into a grand synthesis of thought, the perfect ideal. Hegel was not an atheist. His system of morality did include a God, though not in the classical sense. Hegel's God was also in some sort of way an evolving God, just like his creation, for Hegel was a monist, where the rational individual was a microcosm of the rational absolute. This meant that as the individuals grew in their dialectics towards syntheses of thought, they were being actualized into the great and overall synthesis. This is how we will get what being is in its fullest reality, namely an absolute, all-knowing, completely free and sovereign spirit. Suppose you are looking to become a doctor. So you enroll in a medical school in the hope that one day you would become one. The thesis of your ideal self is that of being a medical doctor. However, as you go through your studies, you realize how difficult medicine is and that there might be a possibility you will not make it through. The fact that you are still not a doctor is the antithesis of your ideal self. This is your non-being. But as you work through your studies and complete your courses, you finally become a doctor. The fact that you became a doctor is an actualized, concrete matter. This is how becoming a doctor is the synthesis between being and not being a doctor. This is what is known as evolutionary idealism. In classical logic, being a doctor and not being a doctor are contradictory. But in Hegelian logic, these contradictory notions are in fact the needed components to be synthesized into reality as the mind develops and grows. What was just described is no small matter. In fact, the entire Western liberal worldview is based on Hegelianism. The notion of liberal tolerance is based on the fact that although we might find conflicting notions in the world, such as Christian values on the one hand and LGBTQ+ values on the other, according to Hegel, these two are not conflicting with each other, but rather working together to form a grand synthesis of thought. This synthesis, which we will call LMNOP, since we like letters so much these days. So in this LMNOP, we will have a little bit of Jesus, a little bit of Muhammad, a little bit of Buddha, a little bit of atheism, a little bit of gayism and transism, a little bit of scientism, to all form up into this one big goop of thought, the grand LMNOP. This is actually what the world is doing right now. We see major religions in the world trying to consolidate and come together, to find common ground, to join together hand in hand into a future where tolerance and mutual understanding takes the place of religious bigotry, dogmatism, and blind hatred. It's kind of nice if we could all come together to make a one big happy family, right? But glorious as this may seem, ecumenism of thought does not come baggage free. The Hegelian notion of synthesis works under the presumption that God is an evolving God who will actualize himself as humanity actualizes itself. No longer is God taken as the absolute objective being who is transcendent from his creation. This matter has in fact struck at the heart of objectivism, because if God is an evolving God, then he is impacted by human knowledge. He is a malleable God, a changeable God. This means that objectivity in this worldview is no longer possible. If all values are accepted as forms of our positive growth, then all values are good, regardless of what they are. Hitler is good, Stalin is good, genocidal thoughts are just as good as the thoughts of feeding the hungry, because they both equally contribute to the growth of our minds. Without an objective God, there is no hope for an objective morality that is independent from humanity. As human nature will come up with every possible contradiction in the spectrum of possibilities, good becomes evil and evil becomes good. Morality itself will become meaningless and value-free. This means that the Hegelian worldview is not possible because it does not account for objective morality. As I have described earlier, objective values are necessarily true because moral anti-realism is logically impossible. However, Hegel was a genius. Hegel tried to reconcile the problem of contradictions in moral relativism by incorporating them into a process ideology, where all contradictory thoughts served an ultimate purpose. But this comes at a price, for if the Hegelian system is to work, we are required to disregard the external world outside the human mind. This meant that there are many prerequisites that we would need to swallow in order to accept this line of thinking, the most evident of which is that reality can be molded according to our wills. This had imposed a redefinition of what objective morality actually is. In classical philosophy, objective values such as morality were universals. They were unchangeable truths. In Hegelian philosophy, values such as reality could change. Now, I'm not one to state that we cannot change reality, for I am not deterministic. In fact, I strongly believe in the human freedom of will. But there is a difference between having freedom of will and having absolute freedom of will. Hegel had developed a worldview that was perfect in every conceivable way except one: the fact that the Hegelian worldview was that, a worldview. The problem which we had begun with was that all these worldviews, such as the many opposing religions and ideologies, were in contradiction with each other. Hegel had appeared to solve that problem once and for all, but the truth of the matter is, all that Hegel did was move the problem a step back, for he tried to encompass all these contradictory worldviews into a single worldview, a grand worldview. But just like every other worldview, the Hegelian worldview itself was not without contradiction or an anti-worldview. As a matter of fact, just as Hegelianism is today a philosophical discipline, so is anti-Hegelianism. This alone is a testament to the fact that Hegelianism's goal at a grand synthesis had failed, for it had found its match in a contradiction that would reduce it to just another contradictory worldview. So effectively, Hegel could not solve the problem of moral relativism, for his synthesis, grand as it may be, is still relativistic and therefore weak in its contradictions. The only way for the Hegelian model to have worked in the world was if it had imposed itself as a totalitarian system of philosophy. In fact, Hegel himself believed that his model was the grand synthesis of all of philosophy, thereby ending all of philosophy. This undertone of philosophical totalitarianism became the foundation of political totalitarianism, later to be culminated by Karl Marx and Giovanni Gentile. Karl Marx had in fact studied under the direct pupil of Hegel, Bruno Bauer, who was a leader in the Hegelian movement. Marx later became known as the father of communism. Giovanni Gentile was also known to be a neo-Hegelian as well as the philosopher of fascism. In addition, many of the greatest philosophers were impacted by Hegel and helped to branch out their own philosophical disciplines. disciplines such as existentialism, Darwinism, nationalism, psychology, progressivism, and postmodernism all trace their sources back to Hegel. The biggest error which the Western world had swallowed up from Hegel was the notion that the phenomena perceived from an external world is all that we need from it in order to evolve into whatever reality we decide upon. This led the West to eventually conclude that what is not perceived by our senses and analyzed by our minds does not even have to exist, for if it does exist, it no longer matters. Hegel had effectively blown the notion of the unknowable reality to smithereens. When Hegel locked reality inside the individual and the collective of humanity, he had effectively set a precedence by asserting that the unknowable part of the external world is no longer relevant to the human condition. This is why today, notions like atheism and materialism are taken as givens in the West. Any discussion regarding the unseen became taboo, and Christianity itself, as well as all of religion, became a relic of a bygone age. It seemed that Hegel got his grand synthesis by capturing philosophy itself. All the modern liberal notions which are taken for granted today operate under the assumption of this grand synthesis, whereby all notions and concepts must be synthesized. This meant that if some Christian came along to say, "I don't want to synthesize Christianity because Christianity is true in of itself," this Christian is now a rejecter of the grand synthesis, thereby holding back the evolution of humanity. Such a Christian would obviously be regarded as a bigot and an unenlightened being. All of a sudden, Christianity finds itself on the defensive against an ideology that wants to melt all other ideologies into it. As Christianity does not wish to join the melting pot, it is now outcast. This is where the tension truly is. On the one side, you have the melting pot, the LMNOP as we called it, that wants to synthesize all ideologies into it, while on the other side you have a religion like Christianity which asserts its independent belief system based on an objective standard outside of creation. As a matter of fact, it is not just Christianity that is fighting the melting pot, but every other belief system that believes in objective truth independently from our human nature. This is where the battle is really fought. For if one understands the validity of objective truth and values, one would be resistant to any fluidity in the moral structure of humanity. It all really boils down to whether there is more to reality than meets the eye. Like I said, all that Hegelianism did was move the problem a step back. The fact that you will need to impose the Hegelian grand synthesis forcibly is proof that the conflicts between the contradictory values do not naturally synthesize in a meaningful way. This is not just theory, but actual proof. For the students of Hegel, namely Marx and Gentile, had influenced the rise of fascism and communism, both of which had made the attempt to synthesize all ideologies into a grand synthesis of thought, a utopia. But the end result was quite the opposite. Instead of a utopia, we got a dystopia. Tens of millions had perished on account of the conflicts of the 20th century on cause of such totalitarian notions, proving to everyone that conflicting notions do not synthesize, they clash. Even today, we find the progressivists still pushing their agendas to synthesize their societies. We find all the liberal notions which promote tolerance and acceptance for all are in fact attempts to socially engineer their communities to conform under one value structure. The civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, the normalization of abortion, the gay and trans movements. These are all meant to promote an open and all-inclusive community where all relative values are generalized into one grand synthesis. What activists like Marx and Gentile tried to implement through quick strides, progressivists today are trying to implement in a gradual and progressive manner. But regardless of whether this grand synthesis is being implemented quickly or progressively, we are always coming up with resistance to it. Progressivism should have been the answer to this problem, because gradual change helps our societies to synthesize these conflicting values with less pressure. But is this what we are finding today? Is the world less under pressure due to all this progressivism, or is it more? In the United States, Christian nationalism is on the rise with its counter values of anti-abortion and anti-transgenderism. Also in 2020, Russian voters affirmed that marriage is strictly between one man and one woman. On account of this, NGOs like Amnesty International stated that the Russian government is on the wrong side of history. Similarly, American progressivists are stating that Christian nationalists are fascists and anti-democratic. This means that all this progressivist synergism is doing nothing to alleviate the pain of conflict between the moral values. As a matter of fact, it continues to be the manufacturer of conflicts as it had been for over a century. Many Christian countries are developing some sort of immunity against this progressivism pushed by the global powers that be. They have come to understand that melting into the grand synthesis would obliterate the most important value of all, the objectivity of values. Hegelian progressivism is proving yet again that it is all merely a worldview, and as such, it will never become all-encompassing without oppressive, totalitarian measures. Sadly, there is no truth in Hegelianism. Had there been truth, it would have conformed with the reality of the world, and we would have all lived in harmony and begun to sing Kumbaya. The fact that it causes strife instead of harmony is proof that it is lacking in its vision of what reality is. This lack of vision in reality reasserts the fact that the metaphysical realm does in fact exist and is still unknowable to us. We have circled back to the metaphysical nature of reality. Since we have conceded that reality is objective and therefore morality is also objective, and because we have also conceded yet again that there is a part of reality which we will never know, then the very nature of a metaphysical realm must be real. It is not that if we explore more of the world, we will discover more to the extent that one day we will know the fullness of reality. We have already proven over the course of millennia that we are utterly incapable of determining our intimately immanent reality, proving that our rational minds and our empirical faculties, being our senses, are compromised. Some might say here, so what? You might have proven a persistently unknowable part of reality, which is the metaphysical part, but you did not prove God. But the fact is, not only did we prove the existence of the metaphysical realm, but we have also proven that this realm is objectively real. It is a realm where the is and the ought are merged into one. No longer would truth be the image of reality and the values be the images of truth, but in a perfectly objective realm, all of values become truth, and all of truth becomes reality. Objective reality always and forever is what it ought to be. This is why the notion of metaphysics is persistent in almost every culture in the world, whereby a supreme presence or God is a necessary cause of being. All that I have proven here today is that the realm of metaphysics is very real and that an objective God has to exist. But what is this metaphysical realm? Which God is true? In the next video, I will prove to you why Jesus Christ is the only true God.